Some secrets are buried so deep that even those who walk above them remain unaware of the darkness beneath their feet. For generations, the Grand Valorian Palace has stood as a symbol of honor, tradition, and unshakable power. Its gleaming marble halls have witnessed coronations, celebrations, and the rise and fall of kings. But beneath its foundation lies a network of tunnels that have harbored truths far more dangerous than any political conspiracy. Prince Alexander had always believed in the righteousness of his family's legacy. Raised to be the perfect heir, he carried himself with the dignity expected of future royalty, never questioning the stories passed down through generations. His trust in his father, King Edmund, and his advisors was absolute. That trust had been his anchor through every public appearance, every diplomatic meeting, every moment when the weight of the crown's future pressed upon his shoulders. But tonight, everything would change. When the palace security team retrieved surveillance footage from the abandoned Eastern Tunnel system during a routine inspection, they uncovered something that would shatter Alexander's world forever. The grainy images revealed events from decades past, moments that had been deliberately erased from official records, actions that painted his beloved family in shadows he never imagined possible. As Alexander stared at the evidence spread across the mahogany table in his private study, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief, he realized that everything he had been taught to honor was built upon a foundation of carefully constructed lies. The man he had revered as a hero, the legacy he had dedicated his life to preserving, and the very ground beneath his feet were all tainted by a truth so devastating that it threatened to destroy not just his faith, but the entire kingdom's future. This is the story of how one young prince's search for truth became a battle for his soul, his family, and the fate of a nation built on deception. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Valorian Palace with an urgency that seemed to mirror Prince Alexander's restless mood. At 28, he had grown accustomed to the weight of expectation that came with being the heir to one of Europe's most respected monarchies. But tonight, something felt different. Perhaps it was the way his father, King Edmund, had avoided his eyes during dinner, or the hushed conversations that seemed to stop whenever he entered a room. Alexander stood in his private study, surrounded by the familiar comfort of leather-bound books and ancestral portraits, when a knock interrupted his brooding. Captain Marcus Reed, head of palace security, entered with an expression that immediately put the prince on edge. "Your Highness," Marcus began, his usually steady voice carrying an odd tension, "we need to discuss something rather urgent." Marcus was a man who had seen everything during his 15 years protecting the royal family. A former military officer with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes, he was not easily shaken. But tonight, his hands trembled slightly as he set a sealed folder on Alexander's desk. "During our routine security sweep of the Eastern Wing, we discovered something in the old tunnel system," Marcus continued. "The tunnels that were supposedly sealed decades ago. The Eastern tunnels were part of palace folklore, built during wartime as escape routes and storage areas. His grandfather, King Richard, had ordered them sealed after the war ended, claiming they posed a security risk. No one had spoken of them for years." "What kind of something?" Alexander asked, though something in Marcus's demeanor already told him he wouldn't like the answer. Marcus opened the folder, revealing a collection of photographs and what appeared to be old surveillance equipment. "We found a hidden camera system, Your Highness. The equipment is old, probably installed in the 90s, but it was still functional. The footage," he paused, swallowing hard. "The footage is quite disturbing." Alexander's blood ran cold. "What's on it?" Instead of answering immediately, Marcus pulled out a laptop and set it on the desk. "I think you need to see for yourself, sir. But I must warn you, this will change everything you think you know about your family's history." The laptop screen flickered to life, showing grainy black and white footage time-stamped from 27 years ago. Alexander recognized the location immediately as one of the tunnel chambers beneath the palace. The image quality was poor, but he could make out several figures moving in what appeared to be a heated discussion. As his eyes adjusted to the poor quality, Alexander's breath caught in his throat. One of the figures was unmistakably his father, though Edmund appeared much younger. The other men were harder to identify, but their body language suggested tension, even conflict. "Can you enhance the audio?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded grimly and adjusted the volume. What came through the speakers chilled Alexander to the bone. His father's voice, younger but definitely recognizable, was speaking in cold, calculated tones about eliminating the problem and ensuring no evidence remains. Alexander watched in growing horror as the conversation continued. They were discussing someone named David Hartwell, a journalist who had apparently been investigating certain royal financial dealings. The men in the tunnel were planning not just to silence Hartwell, but to make sure he disappeared permanently. "This can't be real," Alexander whispered, but even as he said it, he knew it was. The timestamp, the location, his father's distinctive mannerisms, everything pointed to authenticity. Marcus reached over and paused the footage. "There's more, Your Highness. Hours of it. And it gets worse." Alexander felt his world tilting on its axis. David Hartwell, he remembered that name now. The investigative journalist who had died in a car accident in 1997, just weeks after beginning what was supposed to be a major exposé on European royal families. The accident had been thoroughly investigated and ruled accidental, but there had always been whispers, conspiracy theories that the royal family had dismissed as ridiculous. "Who else has seen this?" Alexander asked, his training as a future king already making him think about damage control even as his personal world crumbled. "Only myself and 2 trusted security personnel who discovered the equipment," Marcus replied. "We brought it directly to you." Alexander stood and began pacing, his mind racing. If this footage was genuine, it meant his father was not just complicit in murder but had actively planned it. Worse, it meant the entire foundation of his family's moral authority was built on lies and violence. "What about the other files?" he asked, dreading the answer. Marcus's expression grew even more grave. "The system recorded sporadically over several years. We found evidence of at least 6 other incidents, all involving people who posed potential threats to the royal family's reputation or financial interests." Alexander felt physically ill. 6 others? Political rivals, journalists, even a former palace employee who had apparently discovered irregularities in the royal accounts. All of them met with convenient accidents or simply disappeared. The young prince collapsed into his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was learning. His entire life had been dedicated to upholding the honor and dignity of the crown. He had been raised to believe that his family represented the highest moral standards, that their authority came not just from tradition, but from their commitment to serving their people with integrity. Now he was learning that his father, the man he had looked up to as the embodiment of royal virtue, was a cold-blooded killer who had eliminated anyone who threatened to expose the family's secrets. "There's something else," Marcus said quietly. "The equipment wasn't just recording randomly. Someone was deliberately monitoring these meetings, keeping a record of everything. The question is why?" Alexander looked up from the laptop screen. "What do you mean? Either your father knew he was being recorded and didn't care, or someone else was creating an insurance policy. Given the sophistication of the setup and its hidden location, I suspect the latter. The implications hit Alexander like a physical blow. Someone had been blackmailing his family for decades, holding this evidence over them like a sword. It would explain so many things. His father's occasional moments of unexplained stress, certain political decisions that had never made sense, the family's sometimes surprising generosity to various charitable organizations and individuals. "We need to find out who," Alexander said, his voice gaining strength as his shock transformed into determination. "And we need to know what else they know. I've already begun a discreet investigation. But, Your Highness, we need to consider the bigger picture. If this information becomes public," Alexander didn't need him to finish the sentence. "The revelation would destroy not just his father but the entire monarchy. The scandal would be unprecedented, potentially triggering a constitutional crisis that could tear the country apart. Millions of people who looked to the royal family for stability and moral guidance would feel utterly betrayed." But Alexander also couldn't ignore the fact that his father was a murderer. The journalist David Hartwell had a family, a wife and young children, who had spent 27 years believing their husband and father had died in a tragic accident. They deserved the truth, didn't they? "I need time to think," Alexander said finally. "Continue your investigation, but keep this absolutely contained. I don't want anyone else knowing about this until we understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." Marcus gathered the materials and prepared to leave, but Alexander stopped him. "Marcus," he said, "how long have you known my father?" Nearly 15 years, sir. In all that time, did you ever suspect he was capable of something like this? The security chief was quiet for a long moment. Your father is a complex man, Your Highness. I've seen him make difficult decisions for what he believed was the greater good. But this, he gestured toward the laptop, this level of cold calculation, the deliberate planning of murders. No, I never imagined he was capable of this. After Marcus left, Alexander sat alone in his study, staring at the ancestral portraits that lined the walls. His great-grandfather, who had guided the nation through 2 world wars. His grandfather, who had modernized the monarchy and made it relevant to the 20th century. His father, who had been hailed as a model of dignified leadership. How many of them had blood on their hands? How many of the noble deeds and moral stands that filled the history books were simply public relations exercises designed to hide darker truths? Alexander's phone buzzed with a text message from his younger sister, Princess Sophia. Dad seems stressed tonight. Is everything okay? He stared at the message for a long time before typing back. Everything's fine, just some routine security matters. The lie came so easily that it frightened him. Was this how it had started for his father? Small deceptions to protect the family, gradually growing into something monstrous. As the clock in his study chimed midnight, Alexander made a decision. He couldn't pretend he hadn't seen the footage, and he couldn't simply bury it to protect the family's reputation. But he also couldn't rush into anything without understanding the full truth. He would begin his own investigation, starting with David Hartwell's family. He would discover what the journalist had been investigating and why it had been worth killing for. And he would find out who had been recording his father all these years and what they wanted. The rain continued to drum against the windows as Alexander opened his laptop and began searching for information about David Hartwell. By dawn, he would know enough to begin unraveling the web of lies that had shaped his entire life. But first, he had to decide whether he was strong enough to handle whatever truth he might discover, because once he started down this path, there would be no going back to the comfortable illusions that had defined his world. The young prince who had gone to bed believing his family stood for honor and justice was gone forever. In his place sat a man who was about to discover that the crown he was destined to wear was stained with far more blood than he had ever imagined possible. 3 days had passed since Alexander first saw the footage, and sleep had become a distant memory. Dark circles shadowed his eyes as he sat in a small cafe in downtown Avalon, the capital city, wearing civilian clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Across from him sat Margaret Hartwell, a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and intelligent brown eyes that held decades of unresolved grief. Alexander had tracked down David Hartwell's widow through old newspaper records and phone directories. Getting her to agree to meet had required careful maneuvering. He had posed as a freelance journalist, researching cold cases, claiming to have new information about her husband's death. "I appreciate you taking the time to see me," Alexander began, his voice carefully disguised with a slight accent he had learned during his university years abroad. "I know this must be difficult." Margaret stirred her coffee absently. "After 27 years, you learn to live with the questions, but they never really go away. David was investigating something big when he died, something that excited him more than anything he'd ever worked on." Alexander leaned forward slightly. What was he looking into? Financial irregularities in several European royal families. He'd been working on it for months, following money trails and offshore accounts. He said he was close to exposing a massive corruption network that went all the way to the top. The prince's blood ran cold, but he maintained his composed expression. "Did he share any specific details with you?" Margaret shook her head. "David was careful about his work, especially when it involved powerful people. But I remember he was particularly focused on the Valorian royal family. He said they weren't as clean as their public image suggested." Alexander's hands tightened around his coffee cup. What made him suspicious of them specifically? He had a source inside the palace, someone who had been feeding him information for weeks. David never told me who it was, but he mentioned that this person was taking enormous risks to expose the truth. The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. Someone inside the palace had been working against his family long before the cameras in the tunnel had been discovered. Someone with access to sensitive information who had been willing to risk everything to expose royal corruption. "Did your husband leave behind any notes or documents?" Alexander asked carefully. "The police took everything after the accident. They said it was routine, but when I asked to have his materials returned, they claimed most of it had been lost or damaged. I only have a few personal items they didn't think were relevant." Alexander's mind raced. If his father's people had orchestrated David's death, they would have made sure to destroy any evidence he had gathered. But Margaret's mention of a palace insider suggested that the threat to the royal family hadn't died with the journalist. "Mrs. Hartwell," Alexander said gently, "what if I told you that your husband's death might not have been an accident?" The woman's eyes sharpened immediately. "I've suspected that for 27 years. David was the most careful driver I knew. He checked his car religiously, never took risks on the road. The idea that he would lose control on a straight, dry stretch of highway never made sense. Have you ever tried to investigate further? Do you know what it's like to accuse the royal family of murder? I tried in the early years. I hired private investigators, pestered journalists, even wrote letters to members of parliament. Everyone treated me like a grief-stricken widow who couldn't accept that accidents happen." Alexander felt a crushing weight of guilt. While Margaret Hartwell had spent decades fighting for justice for her murdered husband, he had been living in comfortable ignorance, celebrating his father's public achievements and preparing to inherit a crown built on lies. "What if you could prove it?" he asked quietly. "What if evidence existed that showed your husband was murdered?" Margaret's composure cracked for the first time. "Evidence like that would change everything. Not just for me, but for David's children. They grew up thinking their father died in a senseless accident. To know he died because he was trying to expose the truth, it would give his death meaning." Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "I can't share everything I know yet, but I want you to have this." He handed her a photograph of David that had been included in the palace files, a surveillance photo taken just days before his death, showing him entering a small hotel where he had apparently met with his secret source. Margaret stared at the photo with tears in her eyes. "Where did you get this?" "I can't reveal my sources, but I promise you that I'm going to find out what really happened to your husband. And when I do, I'll make sure the truth comes out." As Alexander prepared to leave, Margaret grabbed his arm. "Be careful," she said urgently. "If they killed David to protect their secrets, they won't hesitate to kill again." The prince nodded solemnly, struck by the irony that he was being warned about the dangerous tendencies of his own father. After leaving Margaret, Alexander drove to a secure location he had arranged with Captain Marcus Reed, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city where they could meet without risk of palace surveillance. Marcus was already waiting when Alexander arrived, along with two other men the prince didn't recognize. "Your Highness," Marcus said, "I'd like you to meet Detective Inspector James Crawford and Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a forensic accountant. They've both agreed to help with our investigation on a completely confidential basis." Detective Crawford was a lean man in his 40s with sharp blue eyes and prematurely gray hair. Dr. Morrison appeared to be in her 30s, with auburn hair and the intense focus of someone accustomed to unraveling complex financial puzzles. "Gentlemen," Alexander said, "before we go any further, you need to understand the gravity of what we're dealing with. The evidence we've uncovered could destroy not just individuals, but the entire institution of the monarchy. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" Both professionals nodded grimly. Detective Crawford spoke first. "I've been a police officer for 20 years, Your Highness. I swore an oath to uphold the law regardless of who breaks it. If the evidence shows that crimes were committed, then justice must be served." Dr. Morrison added, "I've spent my career following money trails and exposing financial crimes. Corruption is corruption, whether it involves street criminals or royalty." Marcus spread the tunnel surveillance footage across a table, along with financial documents they had discovered in a hidden safe behind one of the palace's stone walls. "We've identified at least 8 separate incidents over a 15-year period. Each one follows the same pattern. Someone begins investigating royal activities, they receive warnings to stop, and when they don't comply, they meet with fatal accidents or simply disappear." Detective Crawford studied the timeline Marcus had created. The sophistication level suggests this wasn't just your father acting alone, Your Highness. This was an organized operation involving multiple people, possibly including law enforcement officials who helped cover up the crimes. Morrison pointed to financial records showing large payments to various offshore accounts. These transfers coincide with each of the incidents Marcus identified. Someone was being paid substantial sums of money, probably for services related to eliminating threats. Alexander absorbed this information with growing horror. His father hadn't just been a killer, he had been running what amounted to a royal assassination program, complete with hired professionals and corrupt officials. Who was recording the meetings in the tunnel? Alexander asked. Marcus pulled out another set of documents. We've traced the surveillance equipment to a company owned by Vincent Caruso, a former intelligence officer who now runs a private security firm. The interesting thing is that Caruso has been on the royal family's payroll for years, supposedly providing threat assessment and security consulting. The pieces began falling into place in Alexander's mind. Caruso hadn't been blackmailing the royal family. He had been working for them while simultaneously creating an insurance policy for himself. The recordings weren't evidence of his disloyalty. They were his guarantee that if anything happened to him, the truth would come out. Where is Caruso now? Alexander asked. That's the problem, Marcus replied. He disappeared 3 weeks ago. His office was cleared out, his staff was dismissed, and all his financial accounts were closed. It's as if he never existed. Dr. Morrison looked up from the financial documents. Actually, I think I know what happened to him. Look at this transfer made exactly 3 weeks ago. $50 million from one of the royal family's private accounts to an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet. That's not a payment for services, that's a retirement fund. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. You think my father paid him to disappear? I think your father realized that Caruso knew too much and posed an ongoing risk, Detective Crawford said. Rather than eliminate him like the others, he paid him handsomely to vanish permanently. The implications were staggering. If Caruso had taken copies of all his surveillance material with him, then somewhere in the world was a man with enough evidence to destroy the Valorian monarchy whenever he chose to use it. Alexander's phone buzzed with a message from his private secretary. Your father wishes to see you in his study immediately. Urgent matter. The prince showed the message to the others, and Marcus immediately became alert. This could be routine, but given the timing, he might suspect something, Alexander finished. What should I do? Act normally. Don't give any indication that you know what we've discovered. We need more time to build a complete case. Dr. Morrison added, and we need to find Vincent Caruso. He's the key to proving everything. As Alexander prepared to return to the palace, Marcus pulled him aside. Your Highness, I want you to wear this. He handed Alexander a small device that looked like a fountain pen. It's a recording device. If your father says anything incriminating, we'll have evidence. The drive back to the palace felt like the longest of Alexander's life. With each mile, he was returning to a world that no longer felt like home. The familiar gates and gardens that had once represented security and belonging now seemed like the boundaries of a prison built on lies and murder. King Edmund was waiting in his private study when Alexander arrived, and immediately the prince could sense that something was wrong. His father's usual composed demeanor was strained, and there was a dangerous glint in his eyes that Alexander had never seen before. Sit down, Alexander, the king said quietly. We need to have a very serious conversation. Alexander took a seat across from his father's desk, his heart pounding so hard he was sure it must be audible. The recording device in his pocket felt like it weighed a ton. I've been hearing disturbing reports about unusual activity in the palace security department, King Edmund began. Captain Reed has been conducting unauthorized investigations and accessing restricted areas without proper clearance. Alexander maintained eye contact with his father, drawing on years of diplomatic training to keep his expression neutral. I'm not aware of any unusual activity. What kind of investigations? The king's eyes narrowed slightly. The kind that involve areas of the palace that were sealed decades ago for very good reasons. Areas that contain information that could be misunderstood by people who lack the proper context. The careful phrasing told Alexander everything he needed to know. His father was aware that the tunnel recordings had been discovered, and he was issuing a warning. Father, Alexander said carefully, if there are security concerns, perhaps we should discuss them openly. I am the heir to the throne. Shouldn't I be informed about anything that could affect the monarchy? King Edmund was quiet for a long moment, studying his son's face with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential prey. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a cold authority that Alexander had never heard before. There are things about ruling, about protecting the crown and the nation, that you're not ready to understand. Decisions that must be made for the greater good, even when they require us to act in ways that might seem controversial to those who don't bear the full weight of responsibility. Alexander felt his blood turn to ice. His father wasn't just aware of what had been discovered, he was trying to justify it. What kind of decisions? Alexander asked, his voice barely steady. The king leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming almost philosophical. Every monarch in history has faced moments when the survival of the institution required difficult choices. Sometimes, for the stability of the realm and the protection of millions of people who depend on royal leadership, individual sacrifices must be made. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what Alexander was hearing. His father was calmly explaining his philosophy of murder as a tool of statecraft. And who decides when such sacrifices are necessary? Alexander asked. The king decides, Edmund replied simply, because the king bears the ultimate responsibility for the nation's well-being. That responsibility will one day be yours, Alexander. And when it is, you'll understand that sometimes protecting the monarchy requires us to act in ways that history books will never record. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with King Edmund becoming increasingly explicit about his willingness to eliminate threats to royal authority. By the time Alexander left his father's study, the recording device had captured enough incriminating statements to ensure that justice could finally be served. But as he walked through the palace corridors toward his own chambers, Alexander realized that proving his father's guilt was only the beginning. The real challenge would be deciding what to do with that proof, knowing that the truth could destroy not just his family, but the entire foundation upon which his nation's government was built. The young prince who had entered his father's study still hoping for some innocent explanation was gone forever. In his place walked a man who now carried the terrible burden of absolute knowledge and the even more terrible responsibility of deciding what to do with it. The recording of his father's confessions had been playing on repeat in Alexander's mind for 48 hours. Every word, every casual reference to murder disguised as political necessity, every moment when King Edmund had revealed the cold calculation behind decades of royal accidents. Alexander had barely slept, barely eaten, and had spent most of his time locked in his private chambers, trying to process the magnitude of what he now knew. Captain Marcus Reed had taken the recording to Detective Crawford and Dr. Morrison, and their analysis had been swift and damning. Combined with the financial evidence and tunnel surveillance footage, they now had enough proof to charge King Edmund with multiple counts of conspiracy to commit murder. But Alexander knew that having evidence and knowing how to use it were two entirely different challenges. The knock on his door came at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning. It was his private secretary, Thomas, looking more nervous than Alexander had ever seen him. Your Highness, Thomas said quietly, your father requests your immediate presence in the throne room. He said to tell you that this meeting concerns family honor and cannot be delayed. The throne room. Not his father's private study, not the informal sitting room where they usually had personal conversations, but the most formal and intimidating space in the entire palace. Alexander understood the message immediately. This wasn't going to be a father-son talk. This was going to be a confrontation between a king and a potential threat to his authority. Alexander dressed carefully, choosing a dark suit that projected both respect and authority. If his father wanted to have this conversation in the throne room, then Alexander would meet him as the future king, not as a confused and frightened son. The throne room was a monument to royal power, with soaring ceilings, massive oil paintings of previous monarchs, and an atmosphere designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. King Edmund sat on the ancient throne wearing full ceremonial dress, flanked by 2 royal guards who Alexander didn't recognize. The message was clear. This meeting was being treated as a matter of state security. Approach, King Edmund commanded, his voice echoing in the vast space. Alexander walked forward, maintaining his composure despite the intimidating setup. When he reached the prescribed distance from the throne, he stopped and met his father's gaze directly. "You've been conducting an investigation into matters that don't concern you," the king began without preamble. "You've involved palace security in activities that threaten the stability of the crown. This behavior ends now." "I've been seeking the truth about crimes committed in our family's name," Alexander replied, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "That seems very much like something that should concern the heir to the throne." King Edmund's expression hardened. "You understand nothing about the responsibilities of kingship. You think that truth is some kind of absolute good, that justice is more important than stability. Those are the thoughts of a child, not a future king. Those are the thoughts of someone who believes that the crown should represent more than just power." Alexander shot back. "The people we serve deserve better than leaders who murder anyone who threatens their secrets." The words hung in the air between them like a thrown gauntlet. For a moment, the only sound in the throne room was the ticking of the ancient clock that had witnessed centuries of royal declarations. King Edmund slowly rose from the throne, his ceremonial robes rustling in the silence. "You're going to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, Alexander, and then you're going to make a choice that will determine not just your future, but the future of this entire kingdom." The king descended the steps of the throne platform until he stood directly in front of his son, close enough that their conversation wouldn't be overheard by the guards. "David Hartwell wasn't just investigating financial irregularities," Edmund said in a low voice. "He had discovered that your grandfather, King Richard, had collaborated with Nazi Germany during the early stages of World War II. He had evidence of secret meetings, financial transfers, and agreements that would have destroyed not just our family, but the entire foundation of our nation's war narrative." Alexander felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "That's impossible. Grandfather was a hero of the resistance movement. Your grandfather was a pragmatist who tried to protect the kingdom by playing both sides until he could determine who would win. When it became clear that the Allies would triumph, he destroyed the evidence of his earlier collaboration and created the heroic narrative that history remembers." The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. If this was true, then David Hartwell's investigation had threatened to expose not just financial crimes, but a fundamental lie about Valoria's role in the most important moral conflict of the 20th century. "You killed him to protect grandfather's reputation?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I killed him to protect the faith that millions of people have in the institutions that keep our society stable," King Edmund replied. "Do you understand what would have happened if Hartwell had published his findings? The government would have collapsed. Our allies would have abandoned us. The very idea of legitimate authority in this country would have been destroyed." Alexander stared at his father, trying to process the magnitude of what he was hearing. "So you became a murderer to preserve a lie." "I became a king," Edmund corrected. "I made the choices that leadership requires. Every person I ordered killed was threatening to destroy something larger and more important than their individual lives. The stability of the realm, the faith of the people, the foundation of civilized society. These things are worth protecting, even at a terrible cost." The king began pacing in front of the throne, his voice gaining intensity as he continued his justification. "Do you think I enjoyed it? Do you think I slept well after ordering David Hartwell's death, or any of the others? But I understood something that you clearly don't, that the burden of the crown includes making choices that lesser men couldn't live with." Alexander felt a surge of anger, unlike anything he had ever experienced. "You're talking about murder, not difficult political decisions. You had people killed to cover up crimes and protect your power. I had threats to the kingdom eliminated to preserve the stability that allows millions of people to live peaceful, prosperous lives," Edmund shot back. "Every decision was made with the greater good in mind." "Whose greater good?" Alexander demanded. "David Hartwell had children who grew up without a father. The other people you killed had families, dreams, lives that mattered. How is their suffering justified by protecting royal secrets?" King Edmund's expression grew cold and calculating. "Because the alternative is chaos. Because the moment people lose faith in the fundamental institutions of society, civilization begins to collapse. Because sometimes, for the good of the many, the few must be sacrificed." The argument continued for nearly an hour, with father and son trading philosophical and moral positions that seemed to represent two entirely different worldviews. Edmund spoke of duty, pragmatism, and the harsh realities of leadership. Alexander argued for justice, transparency, and the fundamental human rights that he believed even kings should respect. Finally, King Edmund returned to his throne and fixed his son with a stare that combined authority, determination, and what might have been sadness. You have a choice to make, Alexander. You can accept that what's done is done, learn from it, and prepare to rule with the wisdom that comes from understanding difficult truths. Or you can continue down this path of naive idealism and force me to make another difficult decision for the good of the realm. The threat was unmistakable. Alexander realized that his father was prepared to eliminate him, just as he had eliminated every other threat to royal authority. "You would kill your own son?" Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer. "I would do whatever is necessary to protect the crown," Edmund replied without hesitation, "including ensuring that it passes to someone who understands the true nature of kingship, rather than someone who would destroy everything our family has built in pursuit of some abstract concept of justice." Alexander thought of his younger sister, Sophia, who had always been more politically minded and pragmatic than himself. Would Edmund groom her to take the throne if Alexander proved unwilling to accept the family's murderous legacy? "I need time to consider what you've told me," Alexander said finally. "You have 24 hours, the king replied. "After that, you will either pledge your absolute loyalty and secrecy, or you will be deemed a threat that must be addressed for the good of the kingdom." As Alexander left the throne room, his mind was reeling from everything he had learned. The truth was even worse than he had originally discovered. His family weren't just murderers. They were the inheritors and protectors of a legacy built on Nazi collaboration, covered up through decades of carefully orchestrated killings. But Edmund had also revealed something else. The royal family's crimes were so extensive and so deeply buried that exposing them might genuinely threaten the stability of the entire nation. Millions of people who depended on royal institutions for their sense of national identity and governmental legitimacy would see their faith shattered. Was his father right that some truths were too dangerous to reveal? Or was the real danger in allowing such corruption to continue unchallenged? Alexander returned to his chambers to find Captain Marcus Reed waiting for him, along with Detective Crawford and Dr. Morrison. They had been monitoring his meeting with the king through a small listening device Alexander had concealed in his jacket, and their expressions showed that they understood the gravity of the situation. "We heard everything," Marcus said grimly. "The threat against your life, the revelation about King Richard's Nazi collaboration, all of it." Detective Crawford was studying legal documents he had spread across Alexander's desk. "We have enough evidence to arrest King Edmund for multiple murders. But we also have to consider the political ramifications. If we move forward with charges, we could trigger a constitutional crisis unlike anything this country has ever seen." Dr. Morrison looked up from her laptop, where she had been analyzing financial records. "I've been tracing the money trails related to the Nazi collaboration allegations. If King Edmund is telling the truth about his father's wartime activities, then the financial evidence would be devastating. We're talking about millions of dollars in payments that could only be explained by treasonous collaboration." Alexander slumped into a chair, overwhelmed by the impossible choices facing him. "So what are our options?" Marcus laid out the alternatives with military precision. Option 1. We proceed with the arrests and let the legal system handle the consequences, regardless of political fallout. Option 2. We use the evidence as leverage to force King Edmund's abdication in favor of someone trustworthy. Option 3. We bury everything and hope that the cycle of violence ends with the current generation. There's a fourth option, Detective Crawford added quietly. "We could expose everything publicly and let the people decide how to respond. Full transparency, complete honesty about royal crimes, and faith that democracy is strong enough to survive the truth." Alexander considered each possibility, knowing that his decision would affect not just his own fate, but the lives of everyone in the kingdom. Every choice carried enormous risks and uncertain outcomes. As night fell over the palace, Alexander realized that he was facing the same type of impossible decision that had driven his father to become a killer. The difference was that Alexander still believed there might be a way to choose justice without destroying everything good that the monarchy had achieved. But with only 24 hours to decide, and his father's threat hanging over him like a death sentence, Alexander would need to find allies and options that no one else had considered. The young prince who had started this journey seeking simple answers to difficult questions now understood that the truth, when it finally emerged, would be far more complex and dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The 24 hours King Edmund had given Alexander were nearly up, and the prince had spent every moment of that time in careful preparation. But instead of choosing between the impossible options his father had presented, Alexander had decided to forge an entirely different path, one that would require tremendous courage and might cost him everything, but would finally bring justice to those who had been silenced for decades. Alexander stood in the palace's main conference room, surrounded by people who represented the future he was fighting to create. Margaret Hartwell sat at the large mahogany table, no longer the grief-stricken widow meeting secretly in downtown cafes, but a woman who had finally found allies in her 27-year quest for truth. Detective Crawford and Dr. Sher Morrison were present with their complete files of evidence. Captain Marcus Reed stood near the door, his loyalty finally aligned with justice rather than royal secrecy. But the most important person in the room was Sarah Mitchell, the chief editor of the Valorian Herald, the nation's most respected newspaper. Alexander had made the decision that had eluded him for days. The people deserved to know the truth, regardless of the consequences. Before we begin, Alexander said, addressing the group, I want everyone to understand what we're about to do. Within the next few hours, we will release evidence that will destroy my father's reign, discredit my family's legacy, and potentially trigger the biggest political crisis in our nation's history. And first President initial COVID in 1960. People who had danced in both courts of the people leaned forward and permitted information by them. New powers had endeavored to disperse, and then told them now, what about history is a Springfield in 2015? Once this information becomes public, there will be no way to control the narrative or minimize the damage. Alexander nodded grimly. I've spent my entire life believing that the crown represents honor, service, and moral leadership. If that's not true, if the monarchy is actually built on murder and lies, then the people have the right to know. They have the right to decide for themselves whether an institution built on such foundations deserves to continue existing. Morrison opened her laptop and began displaying financial records that traced the money trail of royal corruption going back 3 decades. We've documented at least 8 murders, millions of dollars in payments to cover up crimes, and evidence of Nazi collaboration that was hidden through violence and intimidation. Detective Crawford spread crime scene photographs across the table. Images from David Hartwell's supposed accident that showed clear signs of sabotage that had been ignored during the original investigation. Every one of these deaths was made to look accidental, but the pattern is unmistakable once you know what to look for. Margaret Hartwell spoke for the first time since arriving at the palace. For 27 years, I've lived with the knowledge that my husband was murdered for trying to expose the truth. Today, his death finally has meaning. Sarah Mitchell was taking notes rapidly, already structuring the story that would change everything. Your Highness, I have to ask. What made you decide to come forward? You could have chosen to remain silent and inherited the throne with these secrets intact. Alexander was quiet for a moment, thinking of the conversation he'd had with his father in the throne room. Because I realized that becoming king doesn't just mean inheriting power. It means inheriting responsibility for every choice made in the crown's name. I refuse to build my reign on a foundation of murder and lies. As the group continued reviewing evidence and planning the release of information, Alexander's phone buzzed with an urgent message from his father's private secretary. His Majesty requires your immediate presence in his study. Your response to yesterday's conversation is expected. Alexander showed the message to the others, and the tension in the room immediately increased. This could be dangerous, Marcus said. If the king suspects what you're planning, I have to go. Alexander replied. If I don't show up, he'll know something is wrong. But I want everyone to continue with the preparations. If something happens to me, the story still needs to come out. Sarah Mitchell was already coordinating with her newsroom staff, arranging for the story to be published simultaneously in multiple outlets to prevent any attempts at suppression. Your Highness will have everything ready within the hour. By tomorrow morning, the entire world will know the truth. Alexander walked through the palace corridors for what he knew might be the last time as heir to the throne. Every painting, every piece of furniture, every symbol of royal authority now represented something different to him. not tradition and honor, but the elaborate facade that had hidden decades of violence. King Edmund was waiting in his study, still wearing the ceremonial robes from their previous confrontation, but this time he wasn't alone. Vincent Caruso, the former intelligence officer who had supposedly disappeared weeks ago, stood beside the king's desk with a briefcase full of what appeared to be documents. "Ah, Alexander," the king said with false warmth. "I believe you remember Mr. Caruso. He's returned from his extended vacation to help us resolve our little family disagreement." Alexander's blood ran cold. Caruso's presence meant that his father had access to all the surveillance footage and evidence that could implicate the prince in the investigation. Worse, it suggested that the king had been planning this confrontation for longer than Alexander had realized. "Vincent has been explaining to me the extent of your recent activities," Edmund continued. "Your meetings with journalists, your coordination with police investigators, your sentimental visit with David Hartwell's widow. It's quite a comprehensive conspiracy against your own family." Caruso opened his briefcase and pulled out photographs that showed Alexander at various stages of his investigation. "His Highness has been very thorough in his efforts to destroy the monarchy. It's almost admirable in a naive sort of way." Alexander realized that he had been outmaneuvered. While he had been gathering evidence against his father, the king had been using Caruso to gather evidence against him. The game had been rigged from the beginning. "So what happens now?" Alexander asked, trying to maintain his composure despite the trap closing around him. King Edmund's expression became almost sorrowful. "Now you face the consequences of your choices. You see, Alexander, I gave you every opportunity to understand the realities of leadership. I explained why difficult decisions must sometimes be made. I offered you the chance to accept the burden of knowledge and move forward as a responsible heir to the throne." The king stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens, where tourists and locals gathered daily to catch a glimpse of royal life. "Instead, you chose to align yourself with people who would destroy everything our family has built. You chose idealism over pragmatism, justice over stability, personal conscience over royal duty." Alexander watched his father's reflection in the window and saw something he had never noticed before: genuine pain beneath the cold authority. King Edmund wasn't just a calculating killer. He was a man who had convinced himself that his crimes were justified by the greater good he believed he was protecting. "I gave you 24 hours to reconsider," Edmund continued. "Instead, you spent that time organizing the destruction of the crown. You've left me no choice but to treat you as I would treat any other threat to the stability of the realm." Vincent Caruso reached into his briefcase again, this time pulling out a syringe filled with clear liquid. "This will make it look like a heart attack," he said, matter-of-factly. "Very sad, very unexpected, but completely natural for someone under the kind of stress that comes with royal responsibilities." Alexander felt his world narrow to the space between himself and the door. But before he could move, the study doors burst open and Captain Marcus Reed entered with a team of armed police officers. "Step away from Prince Alexander," Marcus commanded, his weapon drawn and aimed at Caruso. Detective Crawford followed close behind, carrying an arrest warrant. "King Edmund, Vincent Caruso, you are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Caruso attempted to inject Alexander with the poison, but was tackled by one of the officers before he could complete the act. King Edmund stood motionless by the window, watching as his carefully constructed world collapsed around him. "How?" the king asked quietly, not resisting as handcuffs were placed on his wrists. "We've been broadcasting everything through surveillance equipment placed in your study," Alexander explained. "Every word of your confession, every detail of your plan to murder me, has been recorded and transmitted to news outlets around the world." As his father was led away, Alexander felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and determination. The immediate threat was over, but the real work of rebuilding trust in royal institutions was just beginning. Within hours, the story broke simultaneously in dozens of newspapers and news broadcasts around the world. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The Valeron royal family had maintained power through decades of systematic murder, financial corruption, and the cover-up of Nazi collaboration. The public reaction was immediate and intense. protesters gathered outside the palace demanding the abolition of the monarchy. Political leaders called for emergency sessions of parliament to discuss the constitutional crisis. International allies expressed shock and concern about the stability of Valorian democracy. But amid the chaos and uncertainty, something unexpected began to happen. Alexander's decision to expose his own family's crimes, despite the personal cost, began to resonate with people who had lost faith in their institutions. His willingness to choose truth over power, justice over stability, gave many citizens hope that real change might be possible. 3 months later, Alexander stood in the same throne room where his father had threatened his life. But the ceremony taking place was unlike any coronation in the monarchy's history. Instead of inheriting absolute power, Alexander was being sworn in as a constitutional monarch with strictly limited authority, serving at the pleasure of a democratically elected parliament. The new constitution, written with input from citizens across the kingdom, included provisions for transparency, accountability, and regular review of royal authority. The monarchy would continue to exist, but as a symbol of service rather than power, as a reminder of the importance of moral leadership rather than a guarantee of unquestioned authority. Margaret Hartwell sat in the front row of the throne room, finally seeing justice for her husband's murder. Vincent Caruso and the corrupted officials, who had enabled royal crimes, were serving long prison sentences. King Edmund, though also imprisoned, had been spared the death penalty in recognition of Alexander's belief that the cycle of violence needed to end with his generation. As Alexander spoke his oath to serve the people rather than rule them, he thought about the choice that had brought him to this moment. He had chosen truth over comfortable lies, justice over expedient silence, the uncertain future of democracy over the familiar certainties of authoritarian power. The young prince who had discovered surveillance footage in an abandoned tunnel had become a king who understood that real strength came not from the ability to silence opposition, but from the willingness to face difficult truths and work toward a better future. The palace tunnels had been filled in and sealed permanently, but not before every piece of evidence they contained was made public. The age of royal secrets was over, and the age of royal service had begun. It would be a harder path than the one his ancestors had chosen, but Alexander believed it was the only path that could lead to lasting peace and genuine justice. As the ceremony concluded and the new constitutional monarch took his first steps into an uncertain but hopeful future, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the greatest act of leadership is the willingness to limit one's own power in service of a greater truth.